How are you? The Thing in the House, written by H.F. Scotton, narrated by Edward E. French. Part 2. What was this inconceivable entity whose terrific power we had just seen? What miraculous knowledge had the professor possessed to bring into being this awful thing? What had been his purpose? Would his secret ever be discovered? A dozen such unanswerable questions flashed through my mind. The fact that we could not kill it was not so unreasonable. Any concentrated force composed of coherent atoms could conceivably be of such tenuous construction that it would be invisible. Electricity, magnetism, and various rays are all evidences of some invisible yet potent forces. The puzzle was, how could the professor create a center of power and lend it the attributes of some hideous beast? My mind wrestled in vain with the problem. A few hours later, a trio of mystified men, the Chief, Mac, and I, were deciphering the few and half-effaced words on the scraps of Frankie's letter, which the Chief had salvaged from his dead fingers. Just enough of them were legible to whet still more our curiosity regarding the origin of the thing. They were few, indeed, but they carried a hint of some terrible experiment. We dared not make public the true facts of the night's experiences. The next morning, Mac and I visited the scene of the fire with the coroner. The little that was left of the victims sickened me. Mac was poking about among the ruins with a stick. I saw him stoop, turn over a charred board, pick something from among the debris and thrust it hastily in his pocket. He came quickly to where I stood, well out of earshot of the coroner and his helpers. "I've got 'em!" he whispered excitedly. "The pages of Frankie's letter. The thing must have broken the window and dropped them outside before the fire got to them. A falling board flattened them into the snow, and they were saved." We hastened back to town and hurried to the Chief's office to tell him the news and read, together, the explanation of the thing's existence. Again we were bitterly disappointed. It was impossible to read the story on those blood-stained, water-soaked, and torn sheets of paper. Only comparatively few words were legible. Mac was downcast. "What a story! What a whale of a story!" he grieved. "If only—" "Yes," the Chief answered, "but you wouldn't dare print it." "I guess you're right, Chief, but I could read it." "You may yet have that privilege," I said, gathering up the pages and accepting from the Chief the other scraps he had put in his desk. "I will see what the judicious use of a few acids will do toward making these readable." For days I worked. It was a tedious, laborious task, but I succeeded. Mac called each day and pleaded to be permitted to read the pages as I restored them, but I forced him to wait until the whole was finished. At last it was done, and I held the patched and stained but legible pages in my hand. What a grisly relic they were, drenched in their writer's blood, borne aloft in the unseen claws of that awful monster, miraculously saved from the fire. Those pages carried words that were indelibly printed upon my memory until I could have quoted them verbatim. Never can they be erased from my memory. That evening I had guests, just two, Mac and Chief Mandel. Well they knew why they had been invited. Both concealed their burning curiosity regarding the story I was to read them. I could not resist the temptation to heighten the drama by keeping them in suspense. Leisurely, I reached into the desk drawer and then held up to their gaze those gruesome pages. Each, for a moment, held the sheaf of papers in a trembling hand. I knew that they were visualizing them as they had first seen them, floating, jerking in midair, clutched in the claw of that mysterious entity whose secret the blurred words were now about to reveal. I took the pages, settled myself in a chair, and prepared to read. The Chief stood on the hearth, back to the fire, nervously teetering on heels and toes. Mac restlessly paced the short journey between table and bookcase, back and forth. The letter, like a message from the dead, began. "Chief Mandel, for God's sake, heed these words. I am hiding in the room of a house in which lie the bodies of Professor Alexis Huneberg and Dr. Artemis J. Rixton. In the laboratory, with the body of the professor, there lurks, I am afraid, the horrible monster of his creation that killed him. If it still exists, and should escape, God pity the world. Through the highways and byways would it stalk, tearing limb from limb all whom it should meet, and none to know what it was, for, Chief, this monster is invisible. I'm almost crazed with fear, but I must write this, and you must believe it, for the safety of thousands may depend on your accepting what I tell you is truth. Also, there will be no rest for me, no sanity, until I know if this thing is still alive or non-existent. I've tried a dozen times to force myself to go back into that awful room to find out, but I am afraid. My legs fail me, my nerves collapse. Then, too, when the bodies are found and my presence here becomes known, I would be hunted, always as a murderer, if the monster does not now exist. My black record would be sufficient to convict me, for you know me, Chief. I am Frankie the Frown. I can't stay here much longer. I have no food and no water. Terror lurks in the rest of the house. I dare not leave this room, but tonight I'll run from the house and mail this letter to you from another town. You must believe this, Chief, and bring men to destroy this awful monster. I don't know how you will do it, but I'll tell you all I know about it, and maybe you can consult some scientist and find a way. God, I can hardly write. I'll tell you how I came to be here, Chief, and then you will know I did not kill the doctor and the professor. You will know that I could not turn against and destroy the only friends I ever had. No, Chief, it was the monster. Please believe me. I came here when I got out of jail a little over a year ago. Here followed a more detailed account of Frankie's meeting with his benefactors, an enlargement of the story he had told us in the speeding police car, of how they had befriended him, of his regeneration. He told of his studies under the gentle tutelage of Dr. Rixton, of how he assisted Professor Huneberg in his experiments, of how he grew to almost worship these two venerable men, the first humans to show him any love, to call him son. We could picture him locked in that little room, blinds drawn, lights burning night and day, pitifully terrified, but heroically writing that the world might be made safe from this thing, and that the stigma of murder not be attached to him whose soul had been cleansed and whose honor reclaimed through the benevolence of his friends. I take up the thread of his story further along its pages. I had been here about 9 months when I noticed a subtle change in the professor. I had by this time laid the foundation for a good education. My starved mind seemed to soak up knowledge as a sponge does water. I became intensely interested in my employer's work, having grasped by this time some understanding of their various experiments. The professor's work especially fascinated me. He practiced what he called painless vivisection on animal after animal. The brain was his especial study. Time after time I had seen him remove parts of the skull from different species of monkey, carefully parting the convolutions of the brain matter, holding life in the body until the last possible moment, only to shake his head in disappointment and plunge again into study. One day I asked him what he was searching for, and he said, "The secret of life, my boy." I was not surprised, and such was my confidence in him that I did not doubt he would find it. He did. But a change came over him. He became silent, moody. His eyes continually carried a faraway look, into which at times came a glance of fear. This became more marked as the days went by. He lost weight, ate little, seemed to be losing health rapidly. The doctor was deeply engrossed in some important work of his own and did not notice it. I began to worry. It was one night in the fall when the thing happened that made me doubt his sanity, and mine too, for that matter. We had retired early, the doctor and professor in their bedrooms upstairs, and I in my room here on the ground floor. I could not sleep, and after 2 hours or so of tossing about, arose and wandered into the living room, thinking to read a while. Before I could turn on the light, I heard a voice in the laboratory. It was the professor's. I stepped softly to the open door, wondering whom he could be talking to. There were no lights in there either, but the moon shone brightly through the barred window, and I could see everything plainly. The professor was standing by the work table, one hand resting on its glass top, and the other pointing a long finger at the iron grating which covered the open door into the zoo. I held my breath. He seemed to be talking to the animals in his sleep, but no. His eyes were bright. Intelligence shone from them. What were these strange words he was saying? Ah, you are there. I cannot see you, but I know you exist, beast of beasts. In my mind's eye, I see your form taking shape. Would that I could see you in reality, monster, but no, on second thought, perhaps the sight of your hideous form in the flesh would be too awful for mere human to behold and remain sane. Now your presence manifests itself. The monkeys are cowering in paralyzed and silent terror in their cages. Your horrible stench chokes my nostrils. Your jaws snap. Your claws rake the floor as you throw your invisible bulk against the bars. Chief, I stood frozen to the spot. I swear that as he spoke, I breathed in a reeking stink like comes from a long-dead body taken from the sea. I heard the snapping of jaws and a furious scratching on the floor beyond the iron grating. Something shook and rattled the barred door. The passage on the other side of it was plainly illuminated by the moonbeams, but nothing was there. Something invisible was shaking those bars. The professor's voice went on. Ah, what a triumph for the mind of man! Created, actually created from the emanations of the chemical of life. You are powerful. Oh, how powerful! But the mind of man is more powerful still, for I control your existence and keep you behind those bars. But I am puzzled to know what use to make of you. If I could devise a means to multiply and control you, all the armies of the world would be helpless at my mercy. Ha! What a thought! What an instrument for the abolition of militarism and war you would be! But, I admit it, I'm afraid of you. I feel a slight weakness in concentrating on the thought that you are behind those bars. I played with the thought of what you would do to me if I materialized you here in the laboratory. But the fact that I incorporated the Horla in your makeup I regret, for the Horla was a nemesis. De Maupassant could not overcome it and finally committed suicide. I wonder if I shall have to... but not yet. Not yet, beast of beasts. I must plan first whether it be safe to give you to the world of science. And that is all that I heard that night. Finding strength to move, I fled in silent fear to my room. I could not shut out from my mind the picture of the professor talking to that stinking, invisible thing that clawed the floor and shook the bars of the iron grating. Amazement and terror gripped me. I slept little that night. The next morning I approached the zoo at feeding time, reluctantly. But everything seemed to be in order. The monkeys and other animals seemed to have forgotten their terror of the night. But on this side of the iron grating, plainly imprinted in the sawdust on the floor, were strange, grotesque footprints. With a shuddering foot, I obliterated them. Fearing to cause him unnecessary worry, I said nothing of the night's experience to the doctor. The professor looked haggard, but a strange light gleamed in his eyes. For several nights after that, he crept down to the laboratory, there to hold practically the same conversation with the thing which seemed to come into being at his will. Each night I followed him and listened until my trembling nerves forced me to flee to my room. How he produced the phenomenon I did not then learn, and I dared not ask him. After 3 or 4 nights of eavesdropping came the gruesome end of these nightly visits. I had followed the professor's clandestine footsteps as usual, but when I softly crept to the laboratory door, he was not in sight. A noise in the zoo drew my eyes to the grating. It was open. Presently he came into view leading Chica, the largest of his collection of monkeys. He then fastened the poor beast to the grating with a short chain. Stepping into the laboratory, he closed and locked the grating and stood for a moment gazing through the bars at the trembling monkey. The professor moved to the work table, turned, and again faced the grating. Chica, on the zoo side of the bars, clung to them, whimpering, and peered piteously between them at his master. Instinct must have warned him of a terrible fate. The professor began to speak, to summon, from God knows where, that awful, foul-smelling, invisible horror. In a moment, my startled eyes saw the monkey rise quickly into mid-air, where he hung, suspended, twisting and squirming. Again terror possessed me, and I fled, the beast's smothered shrieks in my ears. The next morning my worst fears were justified. Chica was gone. The professor muttered something about the monkey taking sick in the night. Fearing contagion, he said. He had taken him out and buried him. But in the sawdust on the floor before the grating, I found a hairy foot with dangling, bloody tendons. I almost cried aloud in horror at this discovery. I decided that the awful experiment must stop. I would tell the doctor. I would face the professor with my knowledge of it and beg and plead him to stop his nightly creation of the monster. I had ceased to wonder how he did it in the face of the increasing horror of the situation. I then decided to delay telling the doctor about it. But that night I would follow the professor to the laboratory and boldly present myself before he had time to demonstrate his uncanny power. After retiring, I lay listening for his soft footfalls as he would pass through the hall above my head. I did not hear them. Long after the usual time for his nightly visit to the laboratory, I listened. He did not go. Sleep finally claimed me. Abruptly, I was thrust back into consciousness by a shrill scream. It was repeated. I leaped from bed and dashed downstairs. The doctor's voice drew me into the professor's room, where he was soothing and quieting the terror-stricken man. "Nightmare," the doctor said, and after a few moments' conversation, we again retired. This was the beginning of a series of nightly disturbances of like nature, in which it became more and more difficult to rouse the professor from these awful experiences. They did not seem like nightmares to me, but rather the screams of terror from a man who, wide awake but helpless, sees some nocturnal but real horror about to overwhelm him. The professor's clandestine visits to the laboratory ceased, but each night we were awakened by his screams. Day by day he declined in health. The doctor, alarmed at his condition, vainly attempted to diagnose his ailment, but could learn nothing, increasingly mystified by the recurrent nightmares. At last came the incident that preceded the tragedy. Day before yesterday it was. It seems weeks. The professor, looking wan and haggard, was in the laboratory. The doctor sat at one end of the library table, examining various medical works, his mind on the professor's ailment. At the other end of the table I sat studying. I glanced through the open door into the laboratory, where the professor was peering through the microscope at a bit of chemical on a slide. Something in his attitude caught and held my attention. He raised his head as if to rest his eyes. I saw him wearily pass his hand across them, then look absently into the zoo. Suddenly he stiffened. His eyes bulged in horror, as though beholding some awful menace. He suddenly flung out his hands before him in a gesture of defense, and then screamed. We ran in, caught his flailing arms, and, with difficulty, finally quieted him. We led him into the library and laid him on the couch. The doctor administered a sedative, and he rested quietly for a half-hour. We were astonished at this coming on him in the daytime. Now we knew it was no ordinary nightmare. We feared the worst. He was going insane. While we were discussing, in whispers, his trouble, the professor sat up and spoke. "This is the end, my dear friends. I can resist it no longer. Tomorrow, I shall tell you all. I shall reveal to you the most astonishing discovery the world of science has ever known, and then take my departure into that spiritual world where the soul is at peace, undisturbed by the turbulent emotions and ambitions of this mortal mind. And now, doctor, if you will give me a sleeping draught, and stay by me through the evening and night, I believe I can rest and disturb you no more." What did he mean? What was this discovery? Was he going to die? How? I knew, of course, that this horrible experiment was what he spoke of, but why was there no way out? I still delayed telling the doctor of what I knew, thinking the professor would reveal all, and then he would know just what to do. The professor rested well that night, and the next morning he was more cheerful, although quiet. He spent most of the day in going over his private affairs, placing certain legal papers in a large envelope, which he handed to the doctor, saying, "You may open them after I am gone, and dispose of my possessions not mentioned therein as you see fit, doctor. As you know, I have no relatives." We were stunned by his calm preparations for death. We couldn't believe it. Aimlessly, the doctor and I dragged out the day. A dread of impending calamity loaded down our hearts. Late in the afternoon, the professor called us around the big library table, and after we were seated, spent a few moments in silent meditation. Then he began his amazing explanation. I'll try to write it in his own words as accurately as possible, Chief. For you may have to call in some scientists to find a way to destroy the monster if the professor was wrong and it still exists. I had hoped, the professor began, to overcome the weakness that drew my mind into dangerous channels. But I find it impossible. Voluntarily, I shall become a martyr to science, and by so doing remove from you a very real danger that, God forgive me, I myself created. Doctor, I am confident that I have discovered the true secret of life itself, and that Frankie here may understand it. I will word my explanation in the simplest form possible. Science has determined that all substance is made up of cohering atoms, which in turn are individually miniature solar systems with their planet-like electrons revolving around a sun-like nucleus. Science has also practically decided that these cohering atoms vibrate at various rates. Therefore, we must conclude that all living creatures composed of various substances with their vibrating atoms depend upon vibrations for life. Life is vibration. Now, we must naturally demand to know what sets up and maintains that vibration. When we find the answer to that question, we will have delved as deeply as it is possible to go into the secret of life. I am sure that I have found that answer. The professor paused for a moment and then went on. Imagine a machine, an intricate, marvelously constructed machine. For example, the human body. It is the most wonderful we know of. To live, to move, its atoms must constantly vibrate. Whence comes and what is the force that energizes them? My theory, which I have proved to my own satisfaction, is this. Deep within the machine, in a hidden compartment, probably in the brain, lies a bit of intensely radioactive mineral. So intensely radioactive is it that if we were to break open the machine to find it, it would, upon being exposed, immediately disintegrate. Now let us see how it produces life. The bit of mineral, at its normal rate of disintegration, bombards the atoms of the machine with constant streams of flying particles or electrons, analogous to the comets we see flashing through our solar system. We have a comparison in the similar action of a bit of radium. However, unlike radium, our life-giving mineral can never be isolated and analyzed because of its extreme radioactivity. Under the ceaseless hammering of the streams of electrons from the mineral, the atoms in the human machine vibrate. The machine moves, and there we have life. Finally, the bit of mineral is exhausted. No longer are the atoms bombarded with its flying particles. They cease to vibrate. The machine stops, rusts away, disintegrates. And there we have death. But what becomes of the electrons thrown off from the bit of life-giving mineral? Again, like those mysterious wanderers, the comets, they journey on an inconceivable orbit, but eventually, as willed or directed by some supreme intelligence, they come together, collide, are fused into a new mass in an embryo, and again take up the work of producing the life-giving vibrations in a new human machine. Do you not see how this all fits in with the half-believed theory that our own solar system is but an atom in some vast cosmic body? Human intelligence, the mind, the soul, or whatever name we give it, seems to be a force within, yet not an integral part of the machine. My theory is that it is an induction, a sort of magnetic field, produced by the whirring flight of the flying particles of mineral. We know that an induced or secondary current of electricity, if properly collected and brought to bear on the primary or producing current, can materially disturb its progress. Now, the mind or thought can have a similar effect on the flying electrons from the bit of radioactive material. In fact, intense concentration can control, to a certain extent, their orbit or arrest, temporarily, their flight through space. Telepathy, the power of mind over matter, faith healing, and other more or less proven powers of the mind illustrate this. Perhaps this proves the biblical assertion that man is made in the likeness of God, whose supreme intelligence directs and controls the electron-like comets of a great cosmic body. Though it grieves me to be compelled to shock you with the tragedy of it, I am about to give you a practical demonstration of my theory. As a child, I was endowed with an unusual imagination. Growing to manhood, this characteristic developed into an ability to concentrate thought to the nth degree. When I formed my theory of life, I set about to prove it. Not being able to find the mysterious mineral in the bodies of animals by vivisection because of its extreme radioactivity, I went on to the next step in the experiment, which was to attempt to arrest and control and form into some active organization the flying electrons through intense concentration. I had always been interested in tales of the bizarre, the mysterious. My imagination would run rampant in picturing their grotesque subjects. From them I conceived the idea of creating a creature whose main characteristic would be invisibility. I selected Bierce's sharp-fanged and colorless enigma, the damned thing. F. Marion Crawford's slimy, powerful, and noisome horror in The Upper Berth, and the intangible, persistent Horla of De Maupassant. I imagined a combination of this horrific trio. I concentrated on that mental picture. The flight of emanating particles of mineral from the load in my brain was arrested. They formed into a gaseous, invisible mass, and it came into being. I protected myself by visualizing the horror beyond the barred door in the passage to the zoo. I saw the sawdust on the floor fly from under the scratching claws of the damned thing. I smelt the nauseating stench from the creature of the upper berth as it shook the iron bars of the grating. I felt the terrifying unseen presence of the Horla. God! It was uncanny. And although I was elated at the proving of my theory, I was much afraid, and came quickly from the laboratory, my mind drawn away from concentration. The particles or electrons were released from its restraining power. They resumed their flight, and the invisible creature ceased to be. But I was fascinated by the experiment. Something went wrong with my usually calm reasoning. My mind ran wild, and nightly I repeated with growing perfection the creation of that unseen horror. Finally, to test its power, I took the monkey Chica from his cage, tied him to the bars of the grating, went into the laboratory, and watching, concentrating, saw through the bars poor Chica, literally torn to pieces by the unnameable terror I had brought into being. The professor paused and mopped with shaking hand a damp brow. The doctor was gazing at him with a strange, fascinated look in his wild eyes, but said nothing. The professor continued, "That was enough. I quit my terrible experimenting. Too late. Then came the nightmares. But you were wrong in calling them that. They were the result of my inability to keep my mind from the thing. I would, without volition, begin its creation in my bedroom. Terrorized, I would cry out. You would come to me, and my mind would be drawn away from it. After yesterday's experience in the laboratory, I fully realized the danger. It was inevitable that the thing would get beyond my control. You, Doctor, and Frankie were in constantly increasing danger. And so this is the end. I shall go into the laboratory, bring this thing into being for the last time, and allow it to destroy this human machine of mine, after which, of course, the electrons forming it will be released from the control of my mind, resume their flight, and the danger will be forever removed. That is all." The doctor and I, when he had finished, sat amazed, as though turned to stone. I believed implicitly the incredible story because of the things I had seen. But the doctor, finally speaking, found a flaw in the professor's reasoning. With trembling voice he spoke. But Professor, are you quite sure the emanations from the mineral will be released after death? May not the electrons continue to form the thing, and it remain in existence, forever presenting an invincible menace to all mankind?" "Yes, Doctor. I am quite sure," he answered. "You have seen that I have brought it into existence several times, yet it does not now exist. That proves your fears are groundless. I know that it does not now exist, Professor, but may it not have ceased to be at the end of each materialization because you willed it so? If the mind could bring it into being, it may be necessary for it also to will it out of existence. Thus, if you die with this horror extant, its form may remain indefinitely as you created it because of the lack of further control from your mind. This could easily be possible, as witness the electrons revolving around the nucleus of an atom, or the comets racing on definite orbits through myriad universes. Once set on course, they continue to follow it. No, Doctor, I am sure I am right. The time grows short, or I might be able to refute your theory by reasoning. Instead, I will prove its fallacy by demonstration. I am afraid my mind will not remain much longer in control. To avoid danger, I must go. I must say goodbye. No! No, we cried, springing up in grief-stricken protest. He willed us to silence, with upraised palm, as he drew his once magnificent form to its full height. With solemn voice, he again spoke. Doctor, we have been lifelong friends. Your companionship has meant more to me than I can express in words. Together we have worked to increase knowledge, and our labors have been not all in vain. But to you shall be given the honor of announcing my discovery to the world of science. It is well. I would not have it otherwise. To me, the discovery justifies the end. Sicitur ad astra. Thus one goes to the stars. Such is the way to immortality. Turning to me, he said, My boy, your life here with us has given the lie to those who would say, Ye cannot be born again. And if I had any part in your regeneration, I have been amply repaid by your devotion to us, and your unselfish ministrations to me in my affliction. I charge you with the duty of remaining with the doctor, and comforting him in his declining years, which cannot be so very numerous. Then his voice grew stern as he spoke further. Do not, under any circumstances, come into the laboratory until it is all over, until silence within betokens all danger past. Again, my dear friends, farewell. He gripped our hands firmly and stepped quickly into the laboratory. Closing the door, he drew the blind over its glass panel. For a moment we were paralyzed with fear of what was about to happen. Then, with a common impulse, we sprang to the door, where some unseen power seemed to hold us back. Of course, we could do nothing, even had we had the power to think coherently. Within, all was quiet for a few moments. Presently I detected that terribly nauseating odor creeping from the crack under the door. Then came a hoarse cry and a dull thud, as though the professor had fallen. The jar released the catch on the blind, and it snapped up, revealing to our startled eyes a sight that I hope no man ever sees again. The professor was supine on the floor, writhing and twisting into horribly grotesque attitudes. His eyes, filled with indescribable terror, were seemingly gazing into a face just above his. But we could see no other presence in the room. His mouth was opening, slowly, forced by an invisible pry. The cords stood out from his neck as the muscles involuntarily resisted the action. Slowly the lower jaw came down. Wider opened his mouth, until the bones parted with a sickening crack, and the chin lay loosely on the throat. We gasped in horror, rooted to the spot. The doctor moaned in sickened pity. A terrible fascination seemed to hold our eyes on the frightful scene. Mingled with the inarticulate cries and moans from the professor, we heard a continuous snarling and snapping from unseen jaws. Great blood-spurting gashes appeared all over his body, as clothing and flesh were ripped to ribbons. His legs and arms were moving about, assuming torturous positions, the bones crunching and snapping between invisible fangs. Mauled and torn, gashed and broken, the poor tortured body was suddenly flung upward, suspended in midair, then began to bend and double, backward, head and shoulders meeting the hips as the spine broke with a sickening report. The bleeding and shapeless corpse of the professor fell to the floor, and the sacrifice was ended. The doctor released his death-like grip on my arm and staggered backward. Before I could catch him, he fainted and fell heavily, his head striking the library table. I lifted him and placed him in a chair, but death was already glazing his eyes. As I saw that, all reason left my benumbed brain, and I fled screaming to my room, where I am now hiding and writing this. But, Chief, maybe the doctor was right. Maybe that thing is still in there, alive. If it is, God help. Thus, abruptly, the letter ended. At this point, Frankie's light had burned out and left him in the dark. Terror had overwhelmed him, and snatching up the pages he had fled. As I finished reading the astounding explanation of the horror that had so nearly overcome us, I raised my eyes and looked at Mac and the chief. They were gazing in open-mouthed wonder at the pages in my hand. I held them toward the fire in a suggestive gesture. They nodded. I dropped them on the coals. In a moment, a little mass of glowing ashes was all that met our staring and meditative gaze. The end. Thank you as ever for listening. I'll be back again next week with another one. In the House, Part 2. Written by H.F. Scotton. Is copyright 2020 by Edward E. French. All rights reserved. The copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Address inquiries regarding this recording to email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. That's edwardfrench06@hotmail.com.